Hello, everyone. Welcome from Tel Aviv. It's nighttime already, and we had a very long conference. I'm looking forward to your session. So thank you very much, Shayna, for organizing it. And I hope we have a very fruitful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Shayna Weiss. I am the Senior Associate Director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University. I'm really excited to be here with this panel today. Before I introduce our panelists, I just want to thank Tel Aviv University, Arit Rosen, Ido, Lotan, everyone working really hard. It was an honor to collaborate with you on this really important conference. So today we are gathered to think about what has happened, right? What can we learn and what can we think about from the 30 years since the Rabin assassination? Joining me will be, and I'm greatly shortening all over their bios just in the interest of time. But Tomer Perisco, who is a writer, a thinker, a public intellectual in both Hebrew and English. He is currently a fellow at the Hartman Institute. Anwar Mhajne, who is an associate professor at Stonehill College, thinking about gender and cybersecurity and terrorism and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, among many other things. And Romy Neumark, an accomplished journalist, educator, thinker, nightly news presenter, all sorts of things. She is currently a visiting scholar at Brandeis and also teaches at Harvard University. I just want to start briefly with sort of thinking about and sort of setting the stage for the Rabin assassination. And I think, many of us either remember it or, still think about it. But I want to just remind everyone here that it was November 4th, right? It'll be 30 years tomorrow. The Hebrew day has already passed, 1995, where on Saturday night, after a peace rally to support the peace movement, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by Yigal Amir, a right-wing religious Zionist Jew. We could spend hours talking about that context, what happened, everything afterwards. But I wanted to start by way of introduction. Israelis think about the Rabin assassination as a sort of Kennedy moment or maybe a 9/11 moment for the Americans, that you always remember where you were when you heard about it. So I wanted to ask all of you, who different ages, different backgrounds, where were you? What do you remember in that immediate aftermath about hearing about the assassination? And why don't we start with, here, I'll just start with who's on my screen. Tomer, why don't we start with you?
Of course. So first of all, thank you for inviting me and for organizing this. As it happens, I was there.
Oh, wow.
I was a youth group leader at the time as part of my army service, and it's a left-wing youth group, Hamachanot HaOlim, it's called, and we were there. We were at the event, at the demonstration. It was actually under the headline "Ken LaShalom Lo LaAlimut," yes to peace, no to violence, because the atmosphere in Israel was tense and I would even say venomous. I mean, there was unbelievable incitement against Rabin, led, I have to say, by Netanyahu, also by Ariel Sharon. Usually it's forgotten for Sharon, but he was one of the main people who incited against Rabin. And I mean, every demonstration against Rabin was with, Bedam ve'esh et Rabin negaresh, we will chase Rabin away in blood and fire, etc. So it was a tense situation, and we were there at the demonstration. We were standing there. I was, by the way, more of a Peres person then. If you remember, there was this duo, there was this tension between them. Anyway, Rabin gets on the stage and they sing the peace song, and one of my students asks me, he looks so vulnerable. Someone can get him. And I remember telling her, I mean, there are snipers all over the roofs here. Things are being kept very, very carefully. Don't worry about it. And the demonstration ended, and we were on our way to the bus, and suddenly there was music on loudspeakers stopped, and we saw soldiers running around, and I was sure that there was probably a fist fight or something like that between demonstrators and others and right-wingers or whatever. And then we heard that Rabin was wounded. At the beginning, it was not clear what happened. Shots were fired. Rabin was wounded. We already were on our bus heading towards Ra'anana, where the base camp was of that youth group. And we heard Eitan Haber, who was the secretary of the government, coming out with the news that Memshelet Israel Modia Betadema, the government of Israel is shocked to pronounce that Rabin was murdered, and the entire bus, of course, was crying, and there was anxiety. No, we didn't know what was going to happen now. So it was a traumatic evening, obviously, and we were going to process this over the next weeks and months, but I certainly remember that night vividly.
Thank you. Anwar, let's go with you.
Well, I was really young when that happened.
That's okay.
I was, not to disclose my age, but yeah, I think I wasn't even 6 at the time. But that made me think, actually. I was talking to my students that I haven't known a world where Netanyahu hasn't been a dominant force since I became politically conscious. So that will affect a lot of the analysis I'll probably be giving as well. A lot of my friends on the left, the Israeli left, tell me, Anwar, back then there was so much hope and prospects for peace. And I don't think my generation kind of understands that.
Thank you. Romy.
So I think we're talking about who were the generation that was called the Candle Youth. So if Tomer was there for sure, I was 13. It was an age that, of course, my parents wouldn't allow me to go to Tel Aviv by myself. And I even didn't know anyone who went to this rally, just my 8th grade teacher, Rivka, that now looking back, I'm thinking about the morning afterwards that she was talking to us as kids in Kibbutz Anachoresh, where I learned in middle school. And only now I understand how complicated it was to be the narrator, the first narrator for this age. So I was at home, remember Crocodile Dundee on the television. It was the first month of the Channel 2, the commercial first channel, but it was that night that this channel became something that have momentum and much more viewers. But back then, Crocodile Dundee was on Channel 1. It took some years that I will become a newscaster in Channel 1, the public broadcaster. But when I look as a practitioner in this field now as a journalist, I think we all understand that Channel 2 actually started then. They started to cover this story, maybe similar to the American mindset. The announcer then looked at the clock like Cronkite 30 years earlier, announcing the time of the death of Yitzhak Rabin. There's a memory of Nahum Barnea holding a very big cell phone and cannot report about what's happening from Ichilov, from the hospital. I can say personally that the official certification as myself as a Candle Youth was a week later when I was one of the organizers of the ceremony at school. That the candles were because of all the memory candles in the square and a lot of young people who were there. So in school, we were trying to imitate it and put a lot of candles around us. And I just fainted in front of all my school into the arms of one of my teachers who saw that I'm not standing quite right during the tikva. So this is the candle youth from my perspective as a young child.
Thank you. And I won't go into the whole story here, but I'll add, I'm from Jacksonville, Florida, and you can find the entire story online. But actually, as a sort of indirect result of this, a bomb was placed in the synagogue where I grew up in 1997, after Shimon Peres spoke there, by a local Jacksonvillian, as we call them, who to protest Peres's attempt to keep the peace movement going. And I'll just add that my parents, one of my earlier political memories is also the Rabin assassination. My parents had explained to me about the peace movement, how they themselves were supportive, the shock of the assassination. I think they maybe have even said it at synagogue, or maybe that he had been harmed, or at least people were already talking about it. Then, if you think of the time delay. But I remember then not really understanding, right, in my 12-year-old naivete, what it meant to be against peace. Like, wasn't that a good thing? I obviously didn't know the context and all the discussions, but that's sort of my memory. So, of course, the big thing, and I'm going to sort of here combine two questions into one, is, that the killer came from the world of religious Zionism. As Tomer said, as a lot of you of course know, the political atmosphere was tense, right? Lots of incitement, images of Rabin as a Nazi. There's the sort of Jewish legal argument that Rabin was a rodef, that he was a sort of in this category of someone who was going to kill someone. So one quote had the permission to kill him, the same way, the way the analogy is used usually is that if someone is like breaking into your house, you could kill them before they kill you. And so I want to ask a couple of questions. One is that, thinking about this, was this sort of seen as inevitable, right? And then the other thing is the after effect of this for the religious Zionist world, right? They have felt unfairly blamed, unfairly scapegoated, right? But also at the same time, we see a lot of the figures of religious Zionism, especially those who are active, let's say, in the incitement, as you mentioned, very active in Israeli politics today. So those are all huge questions. But why don't we start with that? And I don't know, Tomer, I know you have a lot to say about that. So why don't we start with you, and Anwar and Romy, feel free to weigh in. You do not all have to weigh in on every question, so know that. And I will also say for the people watching, if you have any questions, and we said this already in the chat, but I'll vocalize it, please put them in the chat and we will answer them later. You do not have to wait. You can put them in now. So why don't we start with that?
Thank you. Look, the whole Oslo process, I think, should be understood from the point of view of religious Zionism as the first major attack, I would say, on their very identity. Since 67, and even more so since the 70s, religious Zionism had invested its whole in the settlement project, in settling Judea and Samaria, extending Israeli or Jewish, presence in the occupied territories. And it had messianic meaning for religious Zionism. It certainly had a social meaning for them. They were now carrying the baton of Zionism from the seculars who had already forgotten. Yes, they have founded the state, but now they are tired, and we are carrying it further. And the Oslo process was an attack on all that. Really an attack on their identity, on their collective identity as the bearers of the next proclamation, the next gospel, which is the settlement of Judea and Samaria. And they took it that way. They took it as an affront. The demonstrations organized against the Oslo process were filled with religious Zionists. And I will say, the Rabin assassination in certain quarters of religious Zionism was received with happiness, was received with relief and gladness. Not all, and certainly some cried about the state the Israeli society had come to. For some, even the contemplation of assassinating a political figure was an anathema. But some were happy, and some were dancing that night. Okay, and so when they shake off the blame of the entire religious Zionist society, it's true that not everyone was, of course, not everyone was to blame, obviously, but also for some it was a regrettable event, but for some it was not, and for some they took this as a redemption of their cause, as a saving act that will save the settlement project, right? And really, you can say that the messianic movement in religious Zionism was dealt the final blow only in 2005 with the disengagement from Gaza. Right? So the Oslo process, they were still processing it. They were still denying, I would say, even today, the inevitable, which is basically that the Palestinians are going to be citizens of some state, either Israel or their own state. You can, on a certain way, you can define the whole religious Zionist existence for the last 50 years as the rejection of that truth. And in the Oslo process, it was the first major test for their point of view. And Rabin was the antagonist to that point of view. And so for them, certainly his assassination was, let's say, met with conflicting viewpoints. I will say one more thing. Mainstream religious Zionism, we need to think of it as basically middle-class, bourgeois Israelis, which are certainly right-wing, certainly are invested in the settlement project. It's part of their collective identity, as I said, even today. But, they're just living their lives. But on the fringes of religious Zionism, and I mean approximately 20% of religious Zionism, which are themselves 12% of the Jewish population in Israel, 10% of the entire population in Israel, we've got religious Zionist fundamentalism. And here we're talking about people like Smotrich, people like Ben Gvir, people who are Temple Mount activists, Hilltop Youth, etc. And these people, which in the process, during the Oslo process, were the most vocal and most violent against Rabin and against the Rabin government. To give an example, Itamar Ben Gvir in 1995, only a few months before the assassination, ripped off the Cadillac emblem of Rabin's official Prime Minister car and said to the camera, "We got to the symbol, we're going to get to Rabin." Okay, this is Itamar Ben Gvir, which is today the Minister of Police of the State of Israel. So just to understand what kind of arc we have been going through, religious Zionism as a mainstream, struggling with the Oslo process and then the disengagement, but the fundamentalist side of religious Zionism gaining power, and today in the highest echelons of the Israeli government. So that's what we need to keep in mind.
Anwar, is there anything you want to add?
While Tomer was talking, I actually came across the new recordings that were released recently of Rabin and his conversations about the border. Like, he was talking about military might and the importance of that. But in it, he talks about how the borders of the state of Israel were never ideological, right? It was like they were a result of circumstances. And for me, we see that shift, that it's not just circumstances, not 1940, not the armistice line, not like the partition plan, not moving to 1967, but now it's becoming an ideology, right? Of what are the borders of the state of Israel, what we want to maintain, what we want to give up, and what we don't need to give up. And I feel there is a sense of euphoria and continuous winning, even after October 7th, and the extent of loss and grief that Israelis are experiencing, have been experiencing since then. it's still a lot for a lot of people that's being viewed as winning, because in the West Bank we see an expansion of settlements, right? If you look at the data from B'Tselem, Peace Now, etc., you see that since October 7th, there was a drastic increase in settlement outposts and also settlement building blocks. The proposal to annex the West Bank, which we saw when J.D. Vance was visiting Israel, the bill was kind of proposed again. And I think one of the fascinating things, we're talking about the Messianic kind of branch of this, but we also see a movement within the left of Israel to like also support these initiatives now. So I don't even know where we draw the line anymore between these policies of the Messianic Judaism or the radical right branch versus the left branch when it comes to the West Bank, when it comes to what is considered the state of Israel, or what is the Palestinian state looks like. And for me, I don't see any differences at the moment. And that's why like we could focus on one group, of course, because Itamar Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, of course, are gaining, they're in a position of power right now, and they're controlling a lot of things that are happening in the West Bank and domestically as well. But I don't know like if that separation really matters anymore. And people might disagree with me over this, but yeah.
Yeah, Romy.
I want to offer the media as some of a bridge. So I mentioned Channel 2 and the way it was into more
Sorry, Romy, I'm going to
emotional.
interrupt you. Can you explain a little bit just how Channel 2 as a commercial channel was different than Channel 1? Because not everyone may understand that context.
Yeah, so Channel 2 is the first commercial channel in Israel. It started at 95 and it started 2 years earlier, but 95 was the breakthrough. And the reason I'm mentioning it again and again is that they did a very smart decision in the night of, like editorial decision, right in the night of the assassination, and decided to send their cameraman to the hospital and to have the breaking news from there, and not to stay like Channel 1 in the square. And I've read that there was even a thought to unite those broadcasts, the channels for the week of Shiv'ah of Rabin, and Channel 1 decided not to. And the difference in the coverage was that in Channel 2, Gidi Gov, one of the famous singers in Israel, for example, was interviewing the grandchildren of Rabin. They were interviewing his wife, they were interviewing his driver. There was something much more emotional in how they covered it. And this is how Channel 2 breakthrough in a way. For today, you can see a lot of reality shows. There's a lot to talk about what Channel 2 or Channel 12, as we call it today, is happening. But I think this is the background needed for your question. But I wanted to say another thing about the media and the religious Zionism, and to connect to what Tomer said, that around that time in Galei Tzahal, one of the most popular, also public, but connected to the Israeli army radio station, like in different places in Israel, there were programs that were trying to unite the people. And there was one program that was aired every morning at 11 a.m. called Hamilah Achrona, Last Word, when someone that is considered right and someone that's considered left are talking and communicating and have those dialogues. One of those circles that were very popular then and somehow might remind us the weeks after October 7th in a way of trying to do it together. Let's speak about it. Let's try to fix it inside us. Uri Orbach, one of the right-wing journalists who are participating in this, and then he became a minister and he became in the political side. He used to say about the religious Zionists, like we were send our best boys to the Air Force, we should send our best boys and girls to Galei Tzahal, to the radio army station, which is like the pipeline to the Israeli media. And I can say that Amit Segal, one of the more right-wing journalists, and I'm sure Tomer and others has more to say about Amit, but he was in the same cohort with me in Galei Tzahal in early 2000. Definitely him and others after him started then with this try that, like in Uri Orbach words, to get into the mainstream. And I think that a lot of the acceptance of Itamar Ben-Gvir in the Israeli media before he became what he is today is due to this normalization of sometimes more Messiah right-wing sayings in the media that we hear since then.
Thank you. A lot to say about that and representation, but I will hold for a second. Anwar, I wanted to return to a point that you made, which is this idea of, sort of our image of Rabin. I think, at least I'll speak as an American Jew, he's remembered as a peacemaker, right? But of course, he had a military career, a very storied military career that on the Israeli side was lauded, right? And gave him, I think, some of the, let's say, stature needed. But of course, for Palestinians, he's remembered very, very differently, right? The architect of let's say the head of the Israeli army during the Six-Day War, right? I don't need to go through his very long, was involved in 1948 as well. I'm not going to go through his whole long military career. But I wanted to ask you sort of, how did and does the Israeli-Palestinian community think about Rabin? And also, if you want, sort of to extend it out to sort of the Palestinian community in a larger sense, right? How do they view this person, both in sort of the immediate context of the assassination and sort of since?
Yeah, so for the Palestinian/Arab community inside of Israel, we know that that time was like the golden age of the relationship between the state and the Arab community. And we know that things have gotten worse with the relationship between the state and Arab parties, as well as the community in general since then. The reason why is when, out of necessity, maybe it's because of necessity, Arab parties help support they voted with the government on the no confidence measure after the Oslo agreements were signed. So they were kind of supporting the government from outside the government. We know that more resources were kind of funneled into the community, and a lot of people still look at him as this person who was brave enough at the time to first start talking to the PLO, and also to kind of even think about or talk about the two-state solution. Now, we say a two-state solution, and I talked to a lot of my Palestinian friends. For them, that's totally different. Even Edward Said critiqued the Oslo framework for a variety of reasons, and we know now on the implementation on the ground how that looks in reality for Palestinians. So early remembrances say, of course, Rabin was one of the people who approved the expulsion of 50,000 people from Lid and Ramle, right? That's relevant to us as a community inside of Israel as well. He also breaking the bones during the first Intifada, the policy as well. So he's remembered for that. And I think we remember him for the last 5 years. And I have to acknowledge he did something that is not traditionally, that was not acceptable and revolutionary at the time in Israel, and still actually until today, and we know he was assassinated. So I don't want to conflate him with any Israeli leader because of what he's done. But his legacy is controversial, and even the Oslo agreement itself, people are celebrating it, but for Palestinians, it's still controversial. I think Edward Said called it surrender, right? Complete surrender. And it made the PA one of the contractors. So for a lot of people, they view it as an extension of the occupation, just in a cheaper, with cheaper means, right? Where a state minus, whatever the narrative is, almost a state, but not really, where we'll maintain control over the Jordan Valley, we'll maintain control over certain territories. I mean, even under Rabin, we saw settlement units being built. We also saw home demolitions in East Jerusalem. So the legacy is not as rosy as we want to kind of frame it today, but in comparison to everything that has been going on, we have to compare it to what we have today and where we are and where we're headed. Unfortunately, there's no ideal scenario in this situation. These were more of hopeful times for the community for the Palestinian community inside of Israel, as well as maybe some kind of hope for a settlement of some sort, right? Now we see with what's going on that we're far away from that vision. And also when it comes to the Palestinian community inside of Israel, we actually saw an interesting shift now where even Meretz is not able to get votes from Arab community, right? Which is a fascinating trend to also pay attention to, because we see a shift either toward boycott of elections or to just voting for Arab parties, regardless of their ideological differences. And we know they vary, like Ram, for instance, is so far away ideologically from Hadash and from Balad. So even the way the community is voting is just for Arab representation, not because, let's say, they ideologically agree with all of their positions on the issue. We see the nation state law being passed, Netanyahu weaponizing the community, they're voting in droves, buses, the whole narrative. The fifth column narrative, of course, after October 7th, that even became worse because the community is the first to interact with the Jewish community after massive attacks and violence. And that results in more repression, suppression. And we saw arrests on campuses. We saw social media surveillance increasing after that. So we see kind of worsening of relationship, and we saw the incidents of May 2021 and then leading to post-October 7th situation. Even though statistically we see that Arab citizens of Israel, around 70 or more, want to be part of the government, yet we see the opposite on the Jewish side of the Israeli spectrum, where a lot of them don't trust Arab parties to be in the government. So fascinating contrast as well.
Yeah, so thank you. And just to make a point clear, because not everyone will remember this, there was an explicit sort of ask, I guess you can say, from the peace camp, as it was called, sort of say, let's call it labor writ large, for the Israeli Palestinian population to vote for them, right? To give them a sort of boost they needed. And they did in a large, and this is one of the things you're talking about. And that has obviously shifted a lot towards, as you said, either boycotting the elections or voting for Arab parties. So that's been a really big and important political shift. I'm glad you mentioned that because I had that as a follow-up point to discuss. Tomer, Romy, is there anything you want to add to sort of thinking about that, and how have Palestinians and the Palestinian community have thought about Rabin and the assassination?
I'll just say, Rabin indeed was perceived, even at the time, as the more right-wing part of the Labour Party. There's Rabin in Paris. Paris was the more leftist, peacenik, right, etc. And Rabin was, he was, the chief of staff of the army. He was a general for many years. Yes, he handled the first Intifada, etc. But again, I think this is just the position that allowed him, as an army security expert, etc., to be able to win the confidence of enough people in Israel to initiate and lead the Oslo process, right? I mean, it also has to do with that. I don't know if Paris could have done the same thing as the prime minister. So, and you're going to see something similar right now with Yair Golan, right? And also, by the way, with Eisenkot, if Eisenkot ever gets to a leading position, they are army people. They're not very left-wing, but they are left-wing enough, I think, to head some sort of process in the direction of a Palestinian state or some sort of compromise.
So I want to start thinking about, we spent sort of the first half of this conversation really thinking about the assassination and the immediate aftermath, and I want to start sort of moving forward. So I'm actually going to sort of go on your last question, Tomer, and this is something that is very much in the news now for a different reason, and that's the pipeline, the political pipeline in Israel, right? Which for the first, basically until Rabin, right, or until, let's say, the Netanyahu age, although he has this in a bit of a different way, there is a pretty, I would say, there is a military to political pipeline, right? That someone who is chief of staff, like Rabin, like many others, like what they do after is a political career, and that they get, and that if someone doesn't have that very storied army career, that maybe they're not qualified, whatever that means, for leadership positions, not just prime minister, but other positions as well. obviously that leaves out a lot of people. That seems to be, I don't want to say shattered because it's still there, but the defense establishment in Israel, right, as you talked about, and the political leadership are no longer the same thing. In fact, there's quite a lot of tension. So I wanted to ask you all, do you think that's a good thing? Do you think that's a bad thing? Right? Like, what does sort of the events of sort of how does military state relations, how has that shifted since Rabin? And what does that mean sort of for Israeli politics? And any of you who want to go can go first.
I can go.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think we have a bit of it's a sort of a ambivalent position in which, yes, we would have loved to have a civilian as prime minister and not automatically support some army general, some retired general, etc. But we need to also understand the context under which there's tension between the political circles and the army, which is Netanyahu's populist government and populist party. Netanyahu draws everyone who does not obey direct commands from him as an enemy of the state and an enemy of the people, right? This is the populist textbook, right? We represent the people. If you don't do as I say, you're an enemy of the people, right? And so the army has taken most of the brunt from Netanyahu's trying basically journey in trying to evade the blame for the 7th of October. So the army didn't wake him up, and the army screwed around, whatever, screwed up in such and such way, etc. And so yes, there's tension, and yes, in a normal functioning democracy with a healthy public sphere, this would have been a good thing that the army keeps in its barracks and civilians run the state. With us, it's different, or with this point in time, and I actually hope that that indeed an honest and qualified person like Eisenkot gets some position in the next government because it's obviously much better than the current situation.
Romy or Anwar?
I can say shortly something about the elite that was sure very militarized, but still is. And we spoke about the religious Zionism as like a new elite that is coming. So it's interesting to look at that through these lens. And I was taken back by your first question about our memories as children. And I think that a lot of the children who grew up after the Rabin assassination and now maybe proved to be right because the political sphere is so toxic, it's like people would think to themselves, why should I do it? What kind of support circles do I have to get into a career in this very toxic political environment? And I remember as a teenager, and even today, there's a lot of journalists who turns to the political sphere. Why should people get into this mess? Would it worth the price? Just a thought that I have about a lot of good people that they're not leading because they are so afraid. And I'm saying toxic, but I think Yitzhak Rabin were the first to pay the biggest price for his values. So
there was just a conference at, I think it was Taub, about the civil service in Israel, and a lot of the conversations that are happening in America, right, sort of maybe on a more extreme level, of course, happening in Israel as well, right? Why would you sign up for a job that is underpaid, right, but is obviously very, well, I would say is very important, that's my bias, it has, in such an environment where it's been denigrated, etc., it's very hard to do work. So it's definitely something.
They're being under attack,
and they're under attack.
They're under attack, or what we call the deep state. Yeah,
right. They're portrayed as sort of deep state, right? I want to ask, and I think you've all mentioned this in different ways. I want to ask about October 7th, right? One of the first things I learned about the study of history, that it's not just like exactly what happened, right? Obviously that's important, but how events change your perspective on earlier things, right? I was in high school during 9/11, so the example was that my history teacher gave was, you know, now the U.S. and the U.S. collaboration with what became the Taliban in the late 70s is now a lot more important, right, than it was 2 years ago. So, I wanted to ask you, right, sort of, if it has, how has October 7th and its aftermath changed what you thought about the Rabin assassination? Have things stayed the same, right? I'll just throw, I've been thinking a lot about intelligence failures and what that means. So I'll leave that as an open question, and sort of Anwar, why don't we start with you, and then Tomer and Romy, if you want to add anything.
I think I just want to say something before we head to about the military civilian kind of relationship. And we see like in a lot of authoritarian contexts how a lot of generals take like the uniform off, put a suit, and then become presidents, and I'm referring to countries, neighboring countries. But the other thinking is a lot, the mandatory military service, where everybody pretty much in Israel, except the ones who have exemption, serve in the military. So eventually the military does have an impact on everybody, right? And we don't have really a separation between what is civilian and military, at least for, it's not a clear separation. And I think any person who wants to gain legitimacy, I think Tomer, like the way the system is set up in itself, will require from somebody to have military service to kind of cater to different audiences, and we saw the 4 or 5 elections in the past few years and how messy that was. But talking about October 7th, I think for me, honestly, I was not surprised by anything. Maybe not even the extent of violence, to be honest with you. I was not, when I received the news on October 7th, I remember, because I'm getting family updates. So it's, we wake up in the morning. I was just like, I look at my WhatsApp group. I'm like, wow, okay. It took me a minute to assess it, but I was not surprised to the level of response. I was not surprised that an attack like October 7th happened. Maybe the extent of like how many people were killed and how long that lasted before any adequate state response was in place, or even like kind of addressing the needs of the victims afterwards. I was not surprised about anything, because I've been noticing this shift of Israeli, like we know, maybe for us as minorities, it's easy for us to notice how radicalized the system becomes, even when it's like small and it does not affect the majority. And that's the thing, because first it comes for the minorities, and then it expands and becomes wider, right? The violence that happens against the weakest element of the population is not just going to stay there. It's always going to like expand and kind of become something that's more prominent in the system itself. And I think I was not, because we've been paying attention to these shifts in the past few decades, like of these radicalization, more and more shift towards extremism on a variety of issues. Like for people, okay, settlements in the West Bank might be for economic reasons, maybe an inconvenience, maybe like it's a national project or religious project, but it's an indication of a political system that is built on maintaining that system, right? To maintain that system, the control of millions of people for that long, it requires massive investment of state institutions, military institutions, societal institutions, right? To justify it, to spend resources on it, to send, your 18-year-olds to serve in these circumstances, and knowing that like even the PTSD and like the trauma that comes, I'm not even talking about what's happening on the Palestinian side, right? That requires a lot. And for me, the assassination of Rabin maybe was like the highlight of that shift, right? It was like building up, and that was the moment where things started rapidly moving in ways that I don't even know how we were going to recover from what's happening today, or where we're headed after this.
Yeah. Tomer or Romy?
Yeah, I'll just say, first of all, Israel has been going towards the right politically, perhaps since the Rabin assassination. I would say more so since the Second Intifada, 2000, 2002. But that has nothing to do with the level of violence that Hamas exhibited on the 7th of October. Hamas is not a resistance movement. It's a fundamentalist Islamist organization. It doesn't want peace. It doesn't want an independent Palestinian state. It wants a Sharia state all over the world, basically, but first of all, in Dar al-Islam or whatever, right? And so I just want to say in response to Anwar, it has nothing to do with what Israel did or didn't do. Even if Israel would have extended its hand in peace, Hamas would have rejected it and probably would have acted the same given the chance. That's that. I will say on that context that the movement rightwards of Israel, it has many reasons, but certainly one of these reasons is a reaction towards what Israelis experienced, and we can argue if that's justified or not, as a rejection by the Palestinians of numerous chances to build coexistence. The Oslo process itself, exploding in the Second Intifada, with buses and cafes actually exploding in cities in Israel. I remember hearing such an explosion one time, people blown to bits a few blocks away, right? This influenced, this affected Israelis. Israelis told themselves, what are we doing? We are, trying to split the country, the land into two states. This is what we get. The 2005 disengagement from Gaza, also with Hamas taking power first in elections, not winning totally the elections, but then in a coup, throwing Fatah members out of rooftops, etc., and building in Gaza instead of a somewhat bearable state. Of course, there's nothing to legitimize the occupation, etc., but instead of trying as much as it can to make the best of the situation, building a terrorist base with 500 kilometers of tunnels underneath. That influences Israelis. That makes Israelis think that perhaps the left wasn't right in extending its hand for peace. And perhaps we need to go another way. I'm a left-wing Israeli, and I think there's no solution apart from the two-state solution. And for me, the entire last 20 years was a tragedy, and my parties were never in government, or almost never, right? But I can understand why other Israelis think the way they do. And I can understand the right-wing trend, which we can say perhaps began with the Rabin assassination and the Oslo process.
Romy, do you want to add anything?
I add something shortly. I'm recently trying to look both on the Israeli media, but as a whole about October 7th through the lens of the trauma. And one of the symptoms of people who suffer from trauma is to divide the world to good and bad. So if they're like the saying, there are no innocent people in Gaza, for example, might come from this reaction and so on. And looking at Rabin's assassination, as part of the Israeli trauma, I think that has a big part in the polarization between right, left, secular and religious in Israel because of the different experiences of that time. I think that in a way, if we look again through those lenses that are trying to be less judgmental, maybe, the fact that both the Israeli media or the Israeli majority of the Israeli people were not even looking at what's happening in Gaza during the war, like this huge blind spot of not looking from the other side of the wall, might be also part of this trauma of like good and bad, and we cannot hold more nuance than that. So this is my first thought about comparing between those two traumas.
I have many questions, but I think I'm gonna ask, and Romy already knows where I'm going, which was one of my interests, which is the conspiracy theories around the Rabin assassination. When I started teaching 10, 15 years ago, because of my own interests, let's say in the weirder parts of life, I always mentioned them. And at first, my students, and here I'm talking about American students, found them also odd, right? Maybe they had heard of the Kennedy conspiracy theories or the 9/11 ones, but it wasn't like part of their political experience. And of course, that's something that's totally changed, right? In the past 5 years or so, that they know plenty of conspiracy theories. Some of them are interested in them for all sorts of reasons. And for those of you who aren't familiar, within really days of the Rabin Assassination, there were conspiracy theories about it, right? Even though we knew pretty quickly that Yigal Amir had done the crime. I'm not going to get into like the different camps and the shirt and the angle of the bullets. You can go into those rabbit holes online, but they all basically say to some extent that this was some sort of state plot, right? And that Yigal Amir is not really responsible. These conspiracy theories have taken on huge sort of importance, especially among religious Zionists. So given sort of everything going on now, not just in Israel, but sort of in the globe about conspiracy theories, about their role in politics, I was wondering if you all could reflect on that, right? And think about sort of what role do these conspiracy theories play in trust of the state, trust of experts, both in Israel and sort of in the globe. So that's a big question. But I know, Anwar, you're thinking a lot about this in one context. So why don't we start with you, and Tomer and Romy, if there's anything you want to add, I'm happy to hear.
Conspiracy theories. I do have a lot, but I want to respond really quickly to Tomer's statement
Also
about
fine.
violence. And I think, violence, definitely experiencing violence, regardless of who committed it and how it's committed against civilians, it's always going to be traumatic, right? And it will cause this cycle that will go. And then there's like Romy's idea about kind of which side are we focused on, how much trauma one can hold, and what we're looking at and examining. And that comes to disinformation, like because with the whole October 7th, there were lots of conspiracy theories, lots of disinformation online. Post October 7th, we saw that. And then with the Trump attempted assassination, we saw that also conspiracy theories, Charlie Kirk assassination conspiracy theories. And we see that these conspiracy theories they're mudding the picture online and it translating to the offline. So what we see online does not just stay there, right? It's becoming this tool to amplify what's happening on the ground in the physical realm, as we say it. And we see that coming from various actors, domestic and international, right? People with regional, international interests in the conflicts that are happening. Our region is very, very important for a lot of actors, for a lot of reasons, and a lot of powers, regional and international. And that amplifies the level of disinformation online about various, either to strengthen the alt-right or the ultra-left. It's actually on every side. It's not just, I know we mentioned a lot the extreme right, but it is also on the extreme left. And we see kind of mirror imaging. It's interesting. We also see it in the Arab sphere as well, where conspiracy theory happening here in the West about Soros, about Zionism, Israel, and like all this translates into the Arabic sphere as well in fascinating ways. And sometimes anti-Semitic discourses that are translated, they're all based on these conspiracy theories, and it's hard to verify it. But also the narrative, that people in Palestinians are like faking the narrative, faking the Pallywood, Gazawood statements and all of that. And it's making it harder for reasonable people to judge reasonably what's happening on the ground. And it's making it harder to have civil conversations, and it's making it harder to kind of help us move forward. It just amplifying a situation that is already extremely violent.
Yeah, there's a adorable, for those of you who live in Somerville, Palestinian cafe, and I was getting some chai there. And actually the woman behind me the entire time was talking about how Mubarak was secretly Jewish, and that's why he loved Israel, which is just like by someone who also heard her say that she's a human rights lawyer from Jordan, right? So just one small example.
Yeah, no, and we see that against women's groups. We see that against anybody that as soon as you say they're a supporter of Israel, or like they're getting paid from Israel, or like that's the easiest way to tarnish anybody's reputation in the region. But we also see, like, those movies claiming the Palestinians are, taking their narratives and like what's happening online, and they're invested in disinformation, etc. I feel like they both muddy the water, and they don't really tell the story, and it's making the situation harder for everybody, not only in the region but outside, as we see here in the US as well.
Yeah, Tomer or Romy?
If I may, I think it's really important always to ask when dealing with conspiracy theories, what's the motive? Like, there are conspiracy theories on the right, on the left, on the center, everywhere. There's always something that drives them. Okay, so sometimes it's just, people's fantasies about whatever. But in the United States, you talked about suspicion of the government. I think that's a motive for many conspiracy theories in the United States. The moon landing, Kennedy assassinations. We just don't trust the government. They're probably up to something, etc., etc. What is the motive behind conspiracy theories about the Rabin assassination? Here, only the right holds conspiracy theories. And I think it's clear that the motive is trying to evade blame, right? Trying to say, Yigal Amir actually didn't assassinate Rabin, it was all the Secret Service doing it, or it was someone else, or it was some setup, or Peres did it. For a long time, there was a conspiracy theory that Peres, in order to inherit Rabin, so Rabin conspiracy theories are a way for the right to evade the humiliating and damning blame of assassinating a prime minister in Israel. That's really it. While the truth is that Yigal Amir was a right-wing religious Jew who sought and got permission, or at least in the hint, like a nod, to assassinate the Israeli prime minister because the Israeli prime minister was in the process of giving parts of the land of Israel to non-Jews. That's what happened, right? And in order to deflect that, in order to negate that, conspiracy theories thrive.
Okay. We only have a minute or so left, but I wanted to just maybe, and just if anyone wants to say anything about commemoration, the very big commemoration ceremony for the Rabin assassination, which happened every year and was now known as Rabin Square, right, sort of this big square in the middle of Tel Aviv, was held for the first 5 years since COVID and the war over the weekend. I actually wrote down the performers just so you get a sense of sort of the sociocultural. Miri Aloni, Dana International, Boaz Sharabi, Esther Rada, Or Amrani Brockman, Valerie Hamati, and Aviv Geffen and Yardena Arazi were asked, but they couldn't go. So that's just a quick thing. And in the minute or so we have left, I wanted to ask you all to comment sort of on commemoration and the politics of commemoration, right? Who is remembering Rabin? How are they remembering it? And sort of what does that say?
I want to say something about the ceremony this weekend. I watched it and I saw Miri Aloni that sang the Sing
Right.
to Peace, the last song that Rabin was in Paris on the stage, and then we remembered the blood on the page that was in his jacket. And she says that in the last years, she sang the word with some changes. Instead of saying one of the words as please do not whisper or pray, she say also whisper or pray. So people who are religious will be able to sing this song for peace. And another word she changed, and I believe she asked the permission of Yankele Rotblit, who wrote the words, was instead of let the soldiers who died to go or to leave, I'm sorry for the bad translation, Hanichu la'olchim, she sang remember those who, the dead. So everyone can sing that song. And I think it's an interesting symbol of how, in order to be more inclusive, sometimes we are losing the essence of this poem, at least.
Yeah. Is there anything, Anwar or Tomer, that you want to add about commemoration? Okay. So we are right at 12 o'clock. So we are going to go, I'm going to hand it over to Gili Cohen, who is one of our doctoral students here at Schusterman, and he will do the Q&A. I encourage you to put in questions in the chat. You can still ask them, and Gili will ask them on your behalf. So without further ado, let's go to Gili.
Hello, thank you all for such an amazing panel thus far, and I'm so glad that I have the privilege to ask you some further questions that I have and that our extremely engaged audience has had thus far. So one of the recurring questions that keeps coming back is related to the peace process and the extent to which some peace process might be recovered. You know, it's been 30 years since the assassination, which means over the course of 30 years, the political landscape in Israel has radically changed and transformed into something that looks, in many ways, unfamiliar to the political landscape prior to the assassination. So I was wondering if all of you had something to say about the sort of radical changes that might be needed in place to move forward and to bring a peace process back onto the table. Yeah, though it's possible that some of you think that it's entirely off the table. There might be certain necessary factors or radical changes that could bring questions of disengagement or reducing settlements, or even we've seen a lot of discussion about a move back to the 67 borders. So I'm interested to see what all of you have to say with respect to these future transformations toward peace.
Can I go first?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, thank you for this question, because it brings me to a point that I wanted to respond to when Tomer was talking. So I do agree that Hamas has a vision of a state that is different than what it can be achieved. And of course, it's not a two-state solution, etc. I do think, though, that there is the PA who has been willing to start negotiations and talking. And I know there are lots of problems, but it's important to take responsibility also for what's happening domestically. Do I think that Israel is going to evacuate all settlements, 67 borders, and go back to it? The answer is no, right? That is absolutely no. We have about a million settlers now in the West Bank. East Jerusalem and West, now Jerusalem is just considered, as there's no negotiations over Jerusalem, or I didn't see any prospect for negotiations when it comes to Jerusalem. We know even now we don't have, there's some sort of something happening in Gaza, but we're not sure what's happening in Gaza clearly about governance. It's like still vague and unclear. So do I see a situation where we can negotiate something sustainable and durable without unifying the West Bank and Gaza under an authority that is respectable by both sides and is willing to talk on both sides, people on both sides to come and talk? I think that I honestly, I don't want to sound pessimistic, I don't see, at least in the current circumstances, unless there's very massive pressure from the EU and the US to move something, I don't see anything happening. But that's kind of my response to this.
Can I? At the beginning of the war, I wrote an article for Haaretz. Like a month into the war, I said, the demand of Israel to split into two states, to implement the two-state solution, will come at the point of the most resistance by Israelis to that solution. And this is the point now. Israelis don't want to hear anything about it, right? People are traumatized by the 7th of October, traumatized by the war, don't trust the Palestinians, don't want to hear anything about it. On the other side, the Palestinians, actually, many of them also don't want to hear anything about it. I just saw a survey by Khalil Shkaki, a very respectable researcher of the Palestinian Society, and I think it was like 49% of Palestinians are pro continuing armed struggle against Israel, okay? Until Israel is wiped out or something, or I don't know what. So that's about half. So the people right now are traumatized, obviously, on both sides, and are in deep pain and mourning. And I think actually what we need right now is very strong pressure from outside, exactly like Trump pressured Israel to get this deal done, right? And Hamas to get the ceasefire right now done. And I think if not that pressure, there's not going to be any movement forward. But I think pressure is coming from Trump, from the European Union, which has recognized basically across the board, except for Germany, perhaps, a Palestinian state. There's going to be pressure from the UN. And there's certainly pressure from the wealthy Arab countries, the Emirates, Saudi, Qatar, etc. And I think there's also going to be simply the pressure of circumstance. Israel can't actually continue occupying half of Gaza without feeding, clothing, educating the population there, and Israel doesn't want to do that. And a lot of money will need to be invested in Gaza to build things up again. For all those reasons, there's going to be pressure on Israel to move forward on some sort of process and to get some sort of solution, some sort of Palestinian state, whatever that even will mean, to be realized. I will mention just before I end, I hope many of you heard that I think a few days ago, Senator Lindsey Graham said that Israel will have to go forward for a two-state solution because there's no other way to keep Israel both Jewish and democratic. And this is perhaps the friendliest, most Zionist Republican alive today, right? Lindsey Graham, and he said this. So I think things are brewing, directions are changing, and I hope to see serious pressure on Israel to that.
I agree with a lot of what you said, Tomer, and the sense that things are happening, or the trend that is changing within the American politics is gonna be very influence this conflict for sure. Israel is polarizing the American Jewish community. It's not the same anymore. It's polarizing the Republican Party. It's polarizing the Democrat Party. And we will see this effect coming into action. I don't know when exactly, but things would not stay the same for sure.
Just if I could add on public opinion in the US, we're noticing a massive shift, as everybody highlighted, within the Republican and Democratic Party when it comes to support to Israel in general, but also like us, support to what's happening and has been happening in Gaza in the past since October 7th, of course. And I think this is going to translate into electoral shifts, of course, but it will take a few years. It will take some time until this translates into an actual political movement. But we already see people like AOC, Sanders, and other people who are actively have been on the left, but also we see Charlie Kirk, even the letter that was released that he sent Netanyahu, and he's like, you're even making it hard for me to explain it to MAGA to MAGA supporters, why we need to invest that much money and support. So I think there's definitely a massive shift. Now, how long it will take, I think it's going to take a few cycles of elections until we see any real results.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I guess this is a bit of a follow-up to this first question that I'm interested in exploring a bit further, and that's the role of religious institutions and non-state actors and civil society orgs who might also place pressure or influence culture. And I was interested to hear what all of you might have to say about whether you think these organizations play an important role, the extent to which they play an important role in transforming political discourse, because this assassination, which took place 30 years ago, was spurred on by religious fundamentalism, but religion also plays a massive role in Israel, Palestine, the public discourse in this region. And maybe there's a greater role that sort of interfaith religious institutions using religion as the discourse to build that negotiation process. So yeah, I'm curious if people think that religion might be effective as a discursive tool, or it might just further cement divide, or if there's certain variables influencing when religion can turn nasty versus being a useful tool for a peace process negotiation.
Shall I say something? Look, religion is problematic, obviously. It's, I mean, I want to use up time in stating the obvious, which is, of course, fundamentalism is a serious obstacle to any peace agreement or conciliation, but religion in general. But I will say, religion can't be ignored. And it's no use for secular politicians and statesmen, state people, sorry, to get into any agreement while ignoring religion, because that would only backfire. And I mean, because religion is there, both peoples here between the river and the sea are very religious, or at least traditional. People are have their beliefs, and they're important to them. They're part of their identity. They won't give them up, and they will have to be seen as part of any agreement. So I mean, that's just the facts. And so I think one of the problems with the Oslo process is that it really didn't take religion into account, and this will have to change. Um, uh, um, I will also just say about what I said before about the religious Zionism specifically. Religious Zionism, I said before, it's about 12% of the Jewish population, about 9-10% of the entire Israeli citizenship, but it's a very important sector of public. Indeed, I think much of Israel's future is dependent of where religious Zionism will go. They are very motivated. They are middle class and upper. They are educated. They are involved in every walk of life of the Israeli public, and they decide many things. As Romy said before, they are now in the media. They're in law. They're in politics, obviously, and in culture. They're everywhere. They're influential, and even just because of that, they will have to be taken into account, and their needs and their desires and their religious beliefs will have to taken into account. By the way, I believe obviously there is a parallel in the Palestinian population, religious elite that needs to be contended with. So I mean, the answer is, while we may hope that religion can be left aside, it can't, and we will have to integrate it.
I think, I mean, we talked about kind of the Jewish and Muslim side of the religious extremism there, but there's also the Christian Zionist branch in the US and how it plays massive influence and funnels a lot of money into the conflict. And I think they definitely cannot be ignored. And I don't know with Tomer, like, we need to address it, but how do we address it, right? And like, what does it mean to separate the state, I guess I'm using US terms, church and state, right, in this sense? And how do we allow the land that is like so holy to so many religions to allow to accommodate all these religions in ways that are respectful? And I think that will be at the core of navigating this. But there's always this worry that focusing on religion alone will take away the idea of territorial issues, right? It's about land at the core of it. So for instance, there is like Hamas. I think Tomer, you mentioned Hamas, and Hamas indeed does have it follows an Islamist framework, but their directed goals is like territorial, right? They're specifically territorial. Well, ISIS, for instance, talked about the caliphate, so it is wider. The main comparison here is it is territorial, and I think the territorial element of it is very important to address as well as we talk about religious frameworks. But interfaith things are, I like watching them. I like seeing them. I like being part of them. To what extent are they effective? Now, that's like another question that I'm not qualified to assess.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just add that one of my, sort of speaking to points you both made is Menachem Froman, who was a fascinating character in and of himself, was a rabbi in the West Bank who met with Hamas sheikhs and leaders. His critique of Oslo was, "Your heretics made peace with our heretics," which is sort of a line I think about a lot. So I'll just add that. And I'll also say, well, I'll say another thing is that Yitzhak Rabin was extremely secular, right? Had basically no regard for the settlements, and I was sort of looking at media reports and things this morning, said, if they show up, he uses the example of Kedum, which was like a sort of unrecognized settlement at the point, they'll leave after 3 weeks because, they don't want a place that doesn't have water or electricity. He was wrong, right? And Daniela Weiss, who is a very outspoken sort of settler, talks about how Rabin totally underestimated them. And I would say that was one of his, as he was, of this secular sort of Sabra generation that had a blind spot for religion, that you can see sort of throughout his own sort of thinking of things. Gili, go for it.
Yeah, for
Romy, is
sure.
there anything you wanted to add, or? Okay.
Okay, yeah. Another question I was interested in asking, and we've seen a lot of discussion of the sort of pervasive social trauma that's being experienced in these regions. And I was curious if any of you had seen initiatives in the past in the territories in Israel, Palestine, or elsewhere that could use trauma-informed policy to kind of respond to this immediate mental health crisis, because that seems to be, in some respects, the most immediate need that a society would have to engage with in order to move on to something like a new peace process, one that's more effective than the sort of failed Oslo peace process. So I was curious if there's any sort of initiative that you've seen in the past that could deal with a sort of trauma-informed policy mandate, if there's certain policies like that currently taking place, and if not, why? Why isn't that?
I just want to add, and I think I just want to add like a term to what you're talking about, is a big sort of foundation of Oslo based on Northern Ireland, and is people-to-people diplomacy, right? This idea that we need people hanging out and talking to each other before the sort of politicians at the top level can make peace. So I was wondering, sort of following up on Gili's questions to put it together, like, what do you think of these initiatives that were sort of a boon of Oslo and that process, and what role might they play now?
I have two thoughts. I will just put it in the air about trauma-informed journalism, which is a thing that somehow is being spoken very much here in the United States, but is just doing their first steps in the Israeli media industry. There was a first cohort of journalists who've been here in Boston and learned about this method of trauma-informed journalism, which is how to interview differently, how to think about the viewer as affected by trauma, and also how to see themselves as as someone who might suffer from trauma and how it affects them inside their newsrooms. So I would love to speak about it maybe in other time about this profession, which I think is very much needed. I have another thought, but please, Tomer and Anwar, take it from here.
I guess, sorry, I have one, like, maybe my thought on this is, how do you address trauma when it hasn't ended, when it's constant and continuous, right? Like, when did it end? Where does it stop? And I don't know, like, that's an important thing to mark when we're addressing trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'll just say, I mean, I don't know anything about trauma treatment, or, I mean, what Romy just said is fascinating, and I think it's totally needed. And I just want to say, make no mistake, we are in the middle of a major mental health crisis here in Israel, and I can't even imagine what's happening in Gaza and also in the West Bank, how much people are traumatized. People here have either lost relatives, or have wounded relatives, or have traumatized relatives, like serious post like shell shock, and or or themselves have been traumatized by, I mean, just civilians that had rockets flying over them and into houses next to them, etc. I was a few weeks ago at the Mail, and a person was dissatisfied by service he got, and he started shouting that he served in Gaza and he spilled his blood, and how can people not respect him, and how can they not give him service that he needs, and it was way out of any proportion. And I realized that this person is actually in post-trauma. He's actually expressing some built-up anger or whatever. It's not anyone's fault, and people were just standing and not knowing what to do. He was shouting, etc. This is what we are going to be dealing with in Israel over the next, I don't know, decade, right? People who have come back from Gaza or have relatives that have come back, and they are traumatized, and the entire population here is traumatized. So again, I mean, this is just a situation, and we will need any professional help that we can get. And by the way, this is also another reason why direct negotiation, direct meetings, dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians, while maybe therapeutically good for some, I don't think is something that can be initiated in a grand scale, which will bring any, peace solution. That's not for now anyway, unfortunately.
I want to say about trauma that, of course, we all need to be more professionals about it, everyone in his circles, and there's a great need of trauma-informed practitioners in every field. But I also start to feel that this trauma is sometimes like a band-aid you put, like Tzav Piyus used to be after Yitzhak Rabin, after the assassination of Rabin. Like, we will do this reconciliation no matter what. We all want to be one, and to heal each other. And I mention it is like I'm alerting because I think that from 30 years distance, we understand that a lot of this was a reaction to something real and to the pain that was there. And we all agree it was traumatizing, but it became like a sticker. And David Grossman, the author, wrote the song of the stickers, Shirat sticker, that Dag Nachash performed, that he took all those stickers that were on the cars in the years after the assassination, and showed that it stayed very shallowed, basically, that you are putting commercials and calling for peace in the same, bump of the car, and nothing stays, basically. So I think we should be also aware when we use this trauma again, that maybe it's hiding something else, because we all agree about it.
Yeah, that's a very powerful image about, I guess what you can put on a bumper sticker is not always the most like profound investigation, and it does speak to that, I guess, shallowness. And I'm interested too in commemoration and public memory, which Shayna already discussed, and I was interested to see if we could unpack a bit further if the commemoration landscape has significantly changed with respect to Rabin, and how public memory has changed as well. If so, if it has radically changed because of the political landscape of, the sort of political ideology associated with Yigal Amir has become more central in Israeli politics, has public memory and commemoration changed to reflect that political shift? And if not, why? If people are still commemorating Yitzhak Rabin's assassination on a national level as this great national tragedy, and there's members who are, ministers in the government who, supported this assassination, then what's being subverted, what's shallowly being hidden?
Well, have no fear. They're not really commemorating Rabin's assassination, the government, right? The whole production the day before yesterday, the whole ceremony was only left-wing parties, left-wing crowd. It's becomes sectorial, partisan, unfortunately, of course, right? The right doesn't want to remember and doesn't want to commemorate, and really uses Rabin, if anything, as a scapegoat for everything that's happening now. It's all because of Rabin and because of Oslo, right? Anything, even the 7th of October. So if the commemoration has changed, it's that. It has become from a state-funded, institutionalized day of reflection and recollection to something that one political camp is interested and invested in. That's it, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So Anna, I was looking up the commemoration event, like that happened yesterday, yes. And one of the headlines was "Globalism, not patriotism," was on display at the Rabin Memorial, which is fascinating to see, like now that it is being framed the way the participants, as well as there were also some protesters being framed in this context, that it's about globalism, not patriotism. And I think that's to see the shift away from understanding the causes of the assassination, what happened around there, to framing these people as ideologically, less Israeli, or ideologically less patriotic, or ideologically less interested in protecting the state. I think that's one of the most classic ways of undermining any movement that pushes for change.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just add, I was, sort of reading this morning through various, newspapers about the reflections. Obviously, a lot of op-eds are running, and I read an op-ed that was in Haaretz by a woman who grew up in the religious Zionist movement, and she mentioned there's a new sort of day of commemoration for the yahrzeit, the anniversary of Rachel, the biblical Rachel. Her Hebrew yahrzeit is the day before, right? So today, I guess, or whatever that day was. So, and that only happened, I mean, obviously it's been known for a long time, but sort of the official commemoration as an official day was instituted after, right, the death of Rabin. I don't have the exact year here, but in the years following it. So the religious Zionist in the sort of Haredi world has a whole nother sort of alternate commemoration, which sort of fills that hole, right? I always say to my students, ritual abhors a vacuum, and this sort of came right in. So that's also another interesting and complicated thing that follows as well.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a minute or two left if anyone, if Anwar, Romy, or Tomer want to offer any final words or thoughts.
If I may, I mean, I feel like it's been, a very tough year, 2 years or more for a lot of people, but it has been honestly a tough, I don't know, maybe my whole life has been tough, dealing with a lot of different political situations. And I think it's easy to just blame. They're not there. We don't have partners. We can't do this. They can do this. And I've seen it in different contexts and multiple settings. And I think continuing this blame cycle, whether you're on the right or on the left, or what ideological camp you align with, or try very hard to force yourself into boxes, is just going to continue adding to this. There's no other way except actually acknowledging what we have, the situation, and how complicated it is, admitting what we've done. And when you say we, it's everybody, what the decisions that we're making that are leading us to this moment, and taking accountability. That is very important. And I think that's what we're lacking, have been lacking in a lot of these conversations and context.
I agree.
Yeah. Sorry, Romy, do you want to add anything?
No, I agree. I think maybe just mentioning this fear that was before the assassination, and of course now, of this happening, now happening again, another political assassination. And we live in a much more violent society, for sure. in our limits, our borders, this is something that, when we think about educating our kids or making decisions, is always there. I used to look, again, to the lens of culture and media, and I want to thank you and the people in the Schusterman Center and Brandeis University to bringing this very rich discussion to the viewers of this webinar and the YouTube channel, because those discussions should not be silenced, because there is always a fear that we'll go back to this, or this will become worse. So thank you.
So with that, I really want to thank you all so much, Tomer, Anwar, Romy, Gili for handling Q&A. I want to Freddie for being behind the scenes and making sure all this runs logistically smoothly. I want to thank again our partners at Tel Aviv University, Orit Rosen, Ido, Lotan, all of you there as well. This will be, as I said, recorded, be on our website after we process it. And thank you all again for joining in on what was a really important and timely conversation. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you,
Thank you very
Shayna.
much. Thank you.